with your prepared, then I'm sure I'll have some questions.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Your Honor, to you and the staff for your time and attention this past week as we have put on our evidence. Last Thursday, we promised the court that the evidence in this hearing would show that the Federal Trade Commission has raised substantial questions about this proposed transaction. Substantial questions about whether this transaction would cause anti-competitive effects in multiple relevant markets. And we promised Your Honor and the court evidence that would be sufficient to raise those questions. And although I never want to take on a higher burden than I have to, I think we have brought Your Honor evidence that shows the answer to even those questions. That's not what we're required to do here. We have brought Your Honor significant evidence about the relevant markets that are at play, about the nature of competition in those markets, the role of content in each of those markets, and critically about Microsoft's ability and incentive to cause competitive harm in each of those markets if this acquisition is completed. Now, all the evidence has shown, Your Honor, that Call of Duty and AAA games in particular, even some of the other Activision franchises, drive gamers. That is the nature of this transaction. It is the nature of the vast majority of the synergies that Microsoft projects coming out of this transaction.
You mean that content is critical?
Content is critical, Judge. Content is critical. We looked this morning at the synergies figures, and there's an existing business line, and there are the synergies lines. And the majority driver by far of the synergies from Microsoft comes from driving users who engage and join Game Pass because they understand the value of this content. Now, we've also heard, Your Honor, quite a bit about decisions involving ZeniMax. Why do we bring all of that evidence about ZeniMax to Your Honor? That evidence, Your Honor, is evidence of Microsoft's incentives when it comes to valuable content.
Well, so let's talk about ZeniMax. So which ZeniMax title is comparable to Call of Duty in that when it was acquired by Microsoft, it was a multi-platform, multiplayer game?
The best example of the 3 or 4 that they've talked about bringing exclusive, I think, is the Elder Scroll franchise. They'll tell you it's not comparable because it's an expansion pack or it's a different kind of a title. But that one we think is one of the most like Call of Duty. And I will say,
well, so then, so that was ZeniMax, and it's currently there's Elder Scrolls 6. I think we heard is coming out.
It is to come. It is not yet launched. Mr. Spencer testified on our examination that they have announced that it will be exclusive. But I want to be very clear. Trying to find analogies and categories of which game is like the other is not going to be the issue before this court. One can always create a category of one. I think lawyers are exceptional at distinguishing. The issue is, if there is a category of one, it's because Call of Duty is so exceptionally valuable. And it's so unique because it's every year and it drives so much revenue. And whether a title from ZeniMax is exactly like it or not on some dimension, what the ZeniMax experience shows is that if Microsoft as a platform owner controls the content, it will use that content to the benefit of its own platforms.
It will use that content in the way to make the most money.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. And our case does not require any more complicated theory of behavior than that. If Your Honor concludes that Microsoft is a profit-maximizing corporation and will use valuable content to aid its shareholders, which is it's right, and that so far as that goes, then the evidence we have shown is the incentives are to use that content to benefit its platforms, and in doing so, it will harm competition because it will take that content and make it day and date.
How does that harm consumers?
So the consumer, Your Honor, instead of having Mr. Kotick head an independent Activision and deploy his platform agnostic philosophy that he talked about on the stand on Direct, Mr. Kotick would bring his content everywhere gamers can be found. He wants them playing all of his content wherever. Now the consumer, if the deal goes through, has to find at least some content, some of it only on the Game Pass.
Oh, you don't mean just day and date. You mean day and date and exclusive.
We mean day and date and exclusive, but also even day and date is a type of exclusivity because they won't give it day and date necessarily to anyone else, right? So having the ability to say, we've launched the game, it's come out on the console, and on the same day it's come to Game Pass, I don't think there's any guarantee, nor can there be, of a day and date to every other possible.
I mean, but like Sony does with Activision, right? I think we heard testimony as to that.
Yes.
That Activision releases games not equally, not in parity.
Right.
They take money
Yes,
from other platforms and delay.
that's right.
Yes.
And there is a difference between exclusivities that are pro-competitive and exclusivities that are not pro-competitive, that are anti-competitive. So this case is not about saying all exclusivities are bad. That is also a red herring and not the FTC's theory. If Sony says to Activision, here's money and we'll help you develop a game or use this money to make something interesting or neat, and the cost of us giving you the money, the quid pro quo is let us have first access for a period of time or exclusive access to the neat new thing created for gamers, that's pro-competitive. That money was used to make something that the consumer or the gamer wants to play and enjoy. The difference, Your Honor, is if you acquire the content, you're not necessarily doing any new investment and you're cutting off that entire process of competition and saying now the game is available only on our platform or certain aspects of it are only available.
Well, why don't we start? Why don't you sort of like be a little bit more precise and
Yes.
tell me exactly what is the harm to consumer, like what they are, maybe tell me what they are, and then let's evaluate each one.
So the harms to consumers are very similar across all of the markets that we've alleged. On the one hand, there's a reduction of choice.
No, but so let's start with the platform market, right? That you have Professor Lee has the Generation 9.
Yes.
9 console market. Okay. So if the merger goes forward, what is the how that substantially lessen competition in a way that harms consumers?
Right. So if the merger goes forward, and if you believe that Microsoft has the incentive to use the content to advantage its own platform, then there will be content, there will be timing issues, there will be exclusivities that benefit only the Xbox and not the PlayStation.
Okay, so now let's break that down. What is the evidence? Aren't we just talking about Call of Duty? I mean, otherwise, then Sony just acquired another publisher. They've shown they make a lot of stuff exclusive, right? So you're saying, and you told me Call of Duty is a different. This case has really always been about Call of Duty and how that's going to drive. So just play that out precisely.
I'm slightly hesitant only because they do have some other pretty exceptional franchises at Activision, like the Diablo franchise we've heard about, and Professor Lee models some of the harms that come from the Diablo franchise as well in his report. But there is no question, Call of Duty is an exceptional asset.
Let me ask you this. So if Sony actually had an agreement with Microsoft, the 10-year to keep Call of Duty and future versions of Call of Duty on PlayStation and future versions of PlayStation, would we be here?
Well, we might be here because we would need to evaluate that agreement and understand all of it.
Let's say it's an agreement and they're going to abide by it, and therefore Call of Duty will be on PlayStation. All the iterations from now for 10 years. Would we be here?
I think we would still have had an investigation.
Well, that's good. Yeah, that's good. You should do that. But here on a preliminary injunction,
I think, I don't want to evade the hypothetical, Judge, but we would be here because of concerns about the other markets. That's what my colleague is telling me.
Okay. Outside the platform market.
Outside of
okay, all right, that's fair. That's fair. I understand that. But that okay. So the console market, then it really comes down to Call of Duty and the concern that Microsoft will leverage it will foreclose it or partially foreclose it in a way that will that people who played it on PlayStation will now have to play it on Microsoft.
I don't want to just give in to the full foreclosure theory. That's another artificially high burden that the defendants have tried to put on the government. Yes, one theory is they might have to, the PlayStation user just has to go get an Xbox. That's one theory. The other types of harm, though, arise from all the myriad ways in which platform holders or owners contract to use the content to push their platforms.
Okay,
Right
so
now,
let's stop. Let's start with full foreclosure, right? Which is what one of the things that Professor Lee focused on. So what is the actual, and we heard a lot about his input into his model and the 20% shift, I guess. What data was he looking at? And I haven't read them all, his declaration. What data was he looking at that he came up with that 20% figure?
And a phone a friend, Your Honor.
Yes, you may phone a friend, absolutely. And the friend can even speak.
My colleague Merrick, that story.
Yes.
Sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Well, I want to know what data, actual data, was he looking at? And I'll just tell you, Dr. Bailey actually looked at real world, this is what is happening data. Did he analyze that data?
Well, Dr. Lee also analyzed real world data, Your Honor. To look at the share shift, Dr. Lee had to look backwards to see in Generation 8, which you have a lot of data for, how various Call of Duty games may have affected that competition if they've been taken away. The reason you do that is because that analysis is backward looking. You know, there's not much data for Generation 9, especially because of the supply shortages that happened.
Okay, so what is the generation data that he looked at? What is it that he looked at?
He looked at both generations. So
No, yeah, but what is the data, the generation data? What is it that it shows?
sales data.
Sales data.
Sales data for Generation 8.
Sales data of just the number of PlayStations and Xboxes sold?
Per unit sales data for games.
Okay. But, and how from that did he extract the people, the players that would leave PlayStation, or maybe they'd keep their PlayStation, but the next iteration that came out, they would buy an Xbox. That's what he's saying, right?
Well, he also used the same telemetry data that Dr. Bailey looked at. But in addition, he used the per unit game sales. And I think,
Where in his report do I see how he used that same data that Dr. Bailey?
I don't have the report in front of me. I thought my colleague could give it to me. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Well, I'll just say that Dr. Bailey, right, 62% of all PlayStation owners don't play Call of Duty at all. So they're not going to move. The foreclosure won't affect them. Right?
62% of all PlayStation users do not play Call of Duty at all.
Right. And then of those that do, most don't play very often. Let's see if I can find it. Can you direct me to, do you know what slide I'm referring to? In theory.